Get a job and stop being a leech! My daughter-in-law shouted across the dinner table, and for a few seconds, nobody moved. Nobody reached for the mashed potatoes. Nobody looked up from their plate. The only sound in the room was the soft hum of the ceiling fan above us, and the faint clink of silverware against porcelain. I stared at the folded napkin in my lap because suddenly I wasn't sure where else to look. I'm Margaret Bennett. I'm 69 years old, and until that night, I believed there were still certain lines families didn't cross. I believed that no matter how difficult things became after losing my husband, respect was one thing that survived. I was wrong. I'm glad you're here. Stay with me until the end and let me know where you're watching from, because I never imagined that one family dinner would change the way I looked at the people I loved for more than 40 years. The dining room felt warmer than usual that evening. Vanessa had lit one of those expensive candles she liked buying from boutique stores downtown. It smelled like vanilla and cedarwood. Dinner sat neatly arranged across the long oak table that my husband Edward had built with his own hands almost 20 years ago. Pot roast. Green beans. Dinner rolls. Emily sat quietly at the far end scrolling through something on her phone. Daniel sat beside his wife, cutting into his food without saying much. I remember thinking how strange the silence felt. Families have different kinds of silence. Some are comfortable. Some are peaceful. This one felt cold. The kind that walks into the room before you even realize something is wrong. Earlier that morning I had overheard Vanessa talking on the phone in the kitchen, but her voice dropped the moment I entered. Daniel had barely looked at me all day. Small things. Tiny things. Things I told myself not to overthink. Ever since Edward passed away 8 months earlier, I had become very careful not to be difficult. I tried not to ask for much. I helped around the house. I folded laundry. Picked Emily up from school when needed. Cooked dinner twice a week. Tried to make myself useful. Maybe that sounds sad to some people. Maybe it is. But after 50 years of marriage, waking up alone changes you. You start shrinking without noticing. You begin apologizing for taking up space. Vanessa suddenly set her fork down beside her plate. You know what I'm tired of, she said. Nobody answered. Daniel kept staring at his food. My hands froze around my glass of iced tea. Vanessa leaned back in her chair and looked directly at me. Then she smiled. Not a warm smile. The kind that never reaches the eyes. Get a job and stop being a leech. I looked at Daniel. I waited for him to laugh and tell me she was joking. I waited for my son to look at me and say, Mom, don't listen to her. But Daniel just looked down. And that hurt more than the words ever could. I do not remember leaving the table that night. I remember standing up slowly. I remember folding my napkin and placing it beside my plate. I remember reaching for my water glass because suddenly my hands felt unsteady. But I do not remember the few steps from the dining room to the stairs. Grief does strange things to a person. Sometimes it makes time feel heavy. Sometimes entire moments disappear like fog. I sat at the edge of my bed and stared across the room at Edward's empty recliner by the window. 8 months had passed since he left this world, but some parts of the house still belonged to him. His reading glasses were still sitting on the small oak table beside the chair. A mystery novel still rested face down where he had left it. His old navy sweater still hung behind the bedroom door because I could never bring myself to move it. Some mornings I convinced myself I could still smell his aftershave in the hallway. I used to wake up before him every day. I would make coffee while he sat at the kitchen counter reading the newspaper. He liked exactly 2 teaspoons of sugar and a little cream. 48 years of marriage creates routines so small that you stop noticing them until they disappear. And when they disappear, the silence they leave behind feels enormous. The house had changed after Edward passed away. Not all at once. Little by little. At first I told myself I was imagining things. Daniel stopped sitting beside me in the living room during movie nights. Vanessa began making decisions without asking me. New furniture appeared in rooms. Pictures moved from shelves. Things shifted places. One afternoon I went to reach for the family photo album in the hallway cabinet and found holiday decorations stacked there instead. Another day I opened the pantry and realized my favorite tea had disappeared. Small things. Tiny things. But grief teaches you to notice tiny things because when someone you love is gone, tiny things become everything. The following morning I woke before sunrise as usual. The house was quiet. I walked downstairs wearing my slippers and my light blue robe. The kitchen window showed the first hints of morning outside. Pale orange light stretched across the backyard fence. I filled the coffee pot and waited for the familiar sound of brewing coffee. For a few minutes I simply stood there. The kitchen felt larger these days. Empty spaces always seem bigger after someone leaves. I wrapped my hands around a mug and stared out toward Edward's garden. He loved that garden. Every spring he spent hours planting tomatoes and roses and trimming hedges with careful attention. Last summer he built a small wooden bench near the fence because he said we needed a place to sit together when we got old. I looked at that bench now and felt something settle heavily inside my chest. Because for the first time, I had started wondering whether I still belonged in the place we built together. Over the next few days I told myself to stop thinking about what happened at dinner. People say hurtful things sometimes. Grief makes people impatient. Stress changes people. I repeated those explanations in my head the same way someone keeps pressing a bruise, hoping eventually it will stop hurting. But small things kept happening, and small things have a way of becoming impossible to ignore. 3 days later I walked into the kitchen around noon, and immediately the room went quiet. Vanessa was standing near the counter with Daniel. She had her phone in one hand and a stack of papers in the other. Daniel was leaning against the sink with his arms folded. The moment they saw me, Vanessa slid the papers underneath a magazine and smiled. It happened quickly. Too quickly. "Morning, Margaret," she said cheerfully. "Morning. Not Mom." Not Margaret with warmth in her voice. Just Margaret. Clean. Polite. Distant. Daniel suddenly looked interested in the coffee machine. "Did you two need something?" I asked. Vanessa shook her head. "Nothing important. Nothing important." Strange how people say that when they mean exactly the opposite. I opened the refrigerator and reached for some orange juice. Behind me I could feel them waiting. Waiting for me to leave the room. I poured myself a glass and stood there a little longer than usual. Not because I wanted juice. Because I wanted to see what happened next. Neither of them spoke. The silence felt uncomfortable. Heavy. Finally I walked away. 20 seconds later I heard voices again. Low voices. Quiet voices. That afternoon I went upstairs to put away laundry and noticed something odd outside the guest room. 3 cardboard boxes sat against the wall. My boxes. I knew they were mine because I recognized the blue marker on the sides. Winter clothes. Family albums. Holiday decorations. I stood there staring at them for several seconds. I had not packed anything. I had not moved anything. Slowly I opened one of the boxes. Folded sweaters. Scarves. Picture frames. Things from my bedroom closet. I looked down the hallway toward Vanessa and Daniel's room and suddenly my chest felt tight. Maybe they were reorganizing. Maybe they were trying to create space. Maybe there was a simple explanation. But I noticed something else later that evening. My sewing basket had disappeared from the living room corner where I always kept it. The small lamp beside Edward's recliner had been moved into another room. Tiny things. Small pieces of my life quietly shifting places while I was still inside the house. That night I lay awake staring at the ceiling fan turning slowly overhead. I remembered something Edward used to say whenever something felt wrong. He always smiled when he said it. "Margaret, people tell you the truth long before they realize they are doing it." I used to laugh every time. But lying there in the dark, I kept hearing those words over and over again. Because for the first time, I started wondering whether I had missed the truth sitting right in front of me. I spent the next morning convincing myself that I was imagining things. I folded laundry. Watered the flowers near the back porch. wiped down kitchen counters that were already clean. I had spent most of my adult life taking care of homes and people. When life felt uncertain, I cleaned. When my thoughts became too loud, I organized things. Maybe because neat rooms feel easier than messy feelings. Around 2 o'clock that afternoon, I decided to look for my old photo albums. I wanted to find pictures of Daniel when he was little. I had not looked through them in months. Sometimes I like sitting near the window with a cup of tea and remembering simpler years. I walked toward the hallway cabinet where I always kept them. But when I opened the doors, the shelves looked different. The albums were gone. In their place sat storage bins filled with candles, folded tablecloths, and Christmas decorations. I stared at the shelves for several seconds. Maybe Vanessa had moved them while reorganizing. I closed the cabinet and checked the guest room closet. Nothing. I looked in the upstairs hallway closet. Nothing there either. Finally, I walked into the garage. I found 3 more cardboard boxes stacked near the back wall. More of my things. More picture frames. More books. More pieces of my life quietly packed away without anyone saying a word. I crouched beside one of the boxes and opened it slowly. On top sat a small wooden picture frame. I picked it up and brushed away a layer of dust. It was a photo from 30 years ago. Edward stood beside me in front of our first house, smiling at the camera, while holding a tiny Daniel in his arms. I looked so young back then. We both did. I remember that day clearly. We had just moved in after years of saving money. The grass in the yard had patches of dirt everywhere. The porch steps needed paint. The roof leaked whenever it rained hard. But Edward stood there smiling like we had bought a mansion. I could still hear his voice. "One day this house will be filled with family, Margaret." And he had been right. Birthday parties. Christmas mornings. School pictures taped to refrigerators. Late-night talks at kitchen tables. 48 years of memories had slowly filled every corner of that house. I sat there on the garage floor holding that frame for a long time. Then I noticed something sitting farther behind the boxes. A folded sheet of paper sticking out from under a storage bin. I reached for it and pulled it free. It looked like a printed checklist. Across the top I saw handwriting in blue ink. Upstairs bedroom. Guest room. Storage. Living room items. Beside several lines were small check marks. My eyes moved slowly down the page until I saw one line near the bottom. Margaret's room. I stopped breathing for a moment. Then I read the words written beside it. Move after decision finalized. I folded the paper and slipped it into the pocket of my cardigan before anyone could see me standing there in the garage. For a few seconds I remained crouched beside those boxes, staring at nothing. My mind kept replaying the same words over and over again. Move after decision finalized. Not if. Not maybe. After. As if some decision had already been made somewhere, and I had simply not been invited into the conversation. I stood up slowly and brushed dust from my knees. Then I carried the old photograph back to my room. I placed it on my nightstand beside Edward's watch and sat quietly for a while. Outside the bedroom window the afternoon sky had started turning soft shades of orange. I used to love that time of day. Edward called it golden hour. He always said the whole world looked kinder when the lights softened. That evening I heard the front door open downstairs around 4 o'clock. Emily was home from school. A few minutes later I heard her backpack hit the floor and her shoes land near the hallway bench. She always dropped things in exactly the same place no matter how many times Vanessa reminded her not to. Some habits survive every lecture. I smiled a little without realizing it. A few minutes later there was a soft knock at my door. Emily stepped inside holding a plate with 2 chocolate chip cookies. "I saved these before Mom put them away," she said quietly. I thanked her and motioned toward the chair beside the window. She sat down and pulled one knee up against her chest. For a few moments neither of us said anything. Emily looked so much like Daniel had looked at 16 that sometimes it caught me off guard. Same blue eyes. Same thoughtful expression. Same habit of staring at the floor when something was bothering him. She kept twisting a loose thread on her sweater sleeve between her fingers. Finally, she looked up at me. "Grandma?" she said softly. "Can I ask you something?" I nodded. "Of course." She hesitated. "Are you moving somewhere?" I felt something tighten inside me. I kept my voice calm. "Why would you ask that?" Emily stared down at her hands again. "I heard Mom and Dad talking a few nights ago." She swallowed. "I was upstairs doing homework and I heard Mom say that everything would be easier once Christmas was over." She looked up at me again. Her eyes suddenly looked uncertain. Then she said. Emily stopped speaking. For a second she looked like she wished she had never started. "What did she say, sweetheart?" I asked gently. Emily looked at me and her voice became almost a whisper. "She said Grandma will not be here by next Christmas anyway." After Emily left my room, I sat there for a long time without moving. The cookies remained untouched on the plate beside me. Outside, the last sunlight had disappeared and soft shadows stretched across the backyard. Somewhere downstairs I could hear the television playing in the living room. I could hear dishes moving in the kitchen. Normal sounds. Ordinary sounds. But suddenly nothing felt ordinary anymore. I kept hearing Emily's voice in my head. "Grandma will not be here by next Christmas anyway." Children tell the truth in strange ways. They do not calculate words the way adults do. They simply repeat what they hear because they do not yet understand the weight certain sentences carry. I looked toward Edward's picture sitting on the nightstand beside me. His smile stared back exactly the same as it had for years. Calm. Steady. Familiar. "Tell me I am overthinking this," I whispered quietly. But the room stayed silent. The next morning I woke up earlier than usual. 5:30 in the morning. The house was still asleep. I got dressed slowly and walked downstairs. For the first time in months, I did not stop to make coffee. Instead, I picked up my purse from the hallway table and reached for my coat. As I stood by the front door, I paused for a moment. My hand rested on the doorknob while I looked back toward the kitchen. A strange feeling moved through me. Not fear exactly. Something colder. Something clearer. For months I had kept telling myself not to ask questions because I did not want to cause problems. I did not want to become the difficult mother. The emotional widow. The burden. But standing there, I realized something. People who care about you do not make you feel guilty for existing. I quietly opened the front door and stepped outside. The morning air felt cold against my face. I drove 20 minutes across town while the sun slowly climbed above the trees. Rush hour traffic had not started yet. Most streets were still quiet. I pulled into a small parking lot beside a brick office building with white columns in front. Hayes and Carter Legal Services. I sat inside the car for a moment, staring through the windshield. Martin Hayes had been Edward's friend for almost 30 years. He had handled paperwork when we bought our first rental property years ago. He had prepared our wills. He had attended family barbecues. I had not spoken with him since Edward's funeral. I almost started the engine again. Almost drove home. But instead I stepped out of the car and walked toward the entrance. 20 minutes later I sat across from Martin in his office while steam rose from a cup of coffee between us. He looked at me for a few seconds before speaking. Then his expression changed. Slowly he leaned back in his chair. "Margaret," he said carefully, "I was actually wondering how long it would take before you came to see me." For a moment I simply stared at Martin. I remember blinking twice because I thought maybe I had heard him wrong. The office suddenly felt too quiet. Behind him, sunlight stretched through the large windows and fell across shelves filled with law books and framed photographs. One picture showed Martin and Edward standing beside a fishing boat from years ago. Both of them smiling. Both of them looking younger. I looked back at Martin slowly. "What does that mean?" I asked. Martin did not answer immediately. He reached for his coffee cup, took a small sip, then set it back down carefully. I noticed the way his eyes shifted toward the desk for a second. People do that when they are deciding how much truth to give you all at once. "Margaret," he said gently, A few months ago, Daniel called my office. I felt my stomach tighten. Martin folded his hands together. He wanted information regarding Edward's estate and certain property matters. I frowned slightly. Property matters? Martin nodded. He asked questions about ownership transfer procedures, long-term residential planning, and how family properties are typically handled after a spouse passes away. I stared at him without speaking. The words sounded formal. Safe. But underneath them I could feel something else moving. Something colder. And? I asked quietly. Martin looked at me for several seconds before opening a folder sitting near the corner of his desk. He slid it toward himself and looked down at a few papers. Margaret, I cannot discuss private conversations beyond certain limits, but I can tell you this. He paused. Daniel seemed very interested in understanding what options existed if a family member needed assisted living arrangements in the future. Assisted living. I felt my fingers tighten around the coffee cup. I looked down at the dark liquid inside it. My reflection stared back at me from the surface. For a second I could not speak. Images started appearing inside my mind one after another. My belongings packed in boxes. Quiet conversation stopping when I entered rooms. The checklist in the garage. Christmas. Grandma will not be here by next Christmas anyway. Martin continued carefully. At the time I assumed he was simply planning ahead after Edward passed away. Families ask questions like that all the time. He looked at me. But there was something else. Slowly he opened another file and pulled out a sheet of paper. He looked uncomfortable now. Really uncomfortable. I had known Martin for decades. I knew his expressions. Knew when something was wrong. He slid the paper across the desk toward me. I looked down. Near the top was my home address. Underneath it were typed notes and estimated numbers. Market value. Renovation potential. Property projections. I felt my breathing slow. Very slow. Then I saw the handwritten note near the bottom of the page. Future family home plan. The strange thing was that I did not cry. Sitting there across from Martin, looking down at those papers, I expected to feel shattered. I expected anger. Hurt. Something loud and dramatic. Instead I felt quiet. Very quiet. Almost like standing outside after a heavy snowfall when everything becomes still. I stared at the numbers on the page for several seconds before sliding it back toward him. Martin watched me carefully. Margaret? He said. I looked up and forced a small smile. I am all right. The words surprised even me. Because somehow they were true. Not because I was fine. I was not. But because for the first time in months, things suddenly made sense. All those strange moments. All those tiny pieces that never fit together before. They fit now. I looked out the office window toward the street below. Cars moved through morning traffic. People walked carrying coffee cups and briefcases. Ordinary lives moving forward while mine had quietly shifted beneath my feet. Do they have any legal authority over my home? I finally asked. Martin blinked once, and then shook his head immediately. No. Just one word. Simple. Clear. I felt something loosen inside my chest. No? I repeated. No, he said again. Edward was careful, Margaret. Very careful. He leaned forward and folded his hands together. The house remains legally yours. The accounts Edward established remain protected exactly the way he intended. I stared at him. For a moment I could not speak. Then I looked down at my wedding ring and slowly turned it around my finger. Edward. Even now. Even after he was gone. Edward had somehow still been standing beside me all this time. When I finally drove home that afternoon, the sun sat high above the neighborhood trees. I parked in the driveway and sat inside the car for a few extra seconds. I looked toward the house Edward and I built together. White shutters. Blue front door. The small flower garden beneath the windows. Home. I walked inside carrying my purse and found Vanessa standing in the kitchen scrolling through her phone. She looked up and smiled. You were gone a while, she said casually. I smiled back. Just running errands. She nodded once and returned her attention to the screen. That was all. No questions. No concern. I stood there looking at her for a second. A week ago I would have searched her face for answers. I would have wondered whether I was imagining things. But not anymore. Because once you finally see the picture clearly, you stop trying to convince yourself that the missing pieces are accidents. I walked upstairs, sat on my bed, and looked toward Edward's empty chair beside the window. Then for the first time in months I smiled. Not because I was happy. Because I finally understood something. They thought I was confused. They thought I was grieving too much to notice. So I decided to let them keep believing that. The days that followed felt strangely peaceful. Not because anything around me had changed, but because I had. I stopped searching faces for honesty. I stopped waiting for explanations. I stopped asking myself whether I was imagining things. Once you know the answer, silence becomes easier to live with. I slipped back into my routine as if nothing had happened. I made breakfast in the mornings. I folded laundry. I picked Emily up from school twice that week because Vanessa said she had appointments. I smiled at dinner and asked Daniel about work. I laughed politely when Vanessa talked about kitchen renovations she wanted one day. I listened carefully. Very carefully. Funny how people reveal themselves when they think you are not paying attention. Thursday evening I was setting plates on the table when I heard voices drifting from the family room. Daniel and Vanessa were talking quietly. I was not trying to listen. I truly was not. But then I heard my name. I slowed my steps without realizing it. I just think it makes more sense, Vanessa said. The upstairs space alone could become Emily's room. There was a pause. Then Daniel sighed heavily. We still need to figure things out first. Vanessa laughed softly. Daniel, come on. Eventually it is going to happen anyway. I stood there holding 2 plates in my hands. For a second I stared at the dining room wall in front of me. Then I simply continued walking. That night after everyone went upstairs, I sat alone in the kitchen with a cup of tea. The digital clock above the stove read 10:47. The whole house felt quiet except for the occasional sound of pipes shifting behind the walls. I reached into my purse and pulled out Martin's business card. I stared at it for a few seconds before dialing his number. He answered after the second ring. Margaret? He said with surprise in his voice. Everything all right? I looked around the empty kitchen. Yes, I said calmly. Everything is fine. I paused. I just wanted to ask something. Of course. I looked down at Edward's wedding ring beside my own hand. I had placed his ring in my pocket months ago and somehow started carrying it everywhere. If someone thought they were making plans for something that was never theirs to begin with, I said slowly, would it be possible to let them continue believing that? The line stayed quiet for a second. Then Martin laughed softly. Not because anything was funny. Because suddenly he understood. Margaret, he said carefully, what exactly are you planning? I smiled while looking out through the dark kitchen window. My reflection stared back at me. Tired eyes. Silver hair. A woman who looked older than she did a year ago. But for the first time in a long time, I recognized her. Nothing complicated, I said quietly. I think I am just going to let them finish telling me who they really are. The following Saturday evening Vanessa announced that she wanted everyone to have dinner together because, according to her, families needed more quality time. I almost smiled when she said it. Almost. For months I had watched her avoid family dinners unless guests were visiting or holidays required appearances. Suddenly she wanted togetherness. Funny how timing works. I spent the afternoon helping prepare dinner like I always did. I peeled potatoes, set the table, folded cloth napkins beside each plate. Outside, cold December rain tapped softly against the windows. Christmas lights from neighboring houses glowed across the street, casting small reflections against the wet pavement. The whole neighborhood looked warm and peaceful. The kind of evening that used to make Edward bring out hot chocolate and old holiday movies. Around 6 o'clock, everyone gathered in the dining room. Emily sat beside me quietly. Daniel looked more relaxed than he had in weeks. Vanessa looked almost cheerful. She kept smiling at her phone between conversations. Every few minutes she would glance toward Daniel and smile again. I noticed things now. Tiny things. The little expressions people think nobody sees. Halfway through dinner, Vanessa leaned back in her chair and looked at me with that same careful smile she had started using lately. "Margaret," she said softly, "Daniel and I have actually been talking about something." I set down my fork and looked up. "Oh?" She exchanged a quick look with Daniel before continuing. "We have just been thinking about the future." Daniel cleared his throat awkwardly. "Mom, Vanessa and I were talking about how hard things have probably been for you lately." Hard things. Interesting phrase. I nodded slowly. Losing Dad and everything. I folded my napkin carefully beside my plate and listened. Vanessa leaned forward slightly. "There are some wonderful communities now for seniors." Her voice sounded sweet. Concerned. Gentle. Beautiful places with activities and friends and walking groups and all kinds of things. I looked at her without speaking. Emily suddenly stared down at her plate. Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Vanessa continued smiling. "People your age really seem happy in places like that." People your age. I noticed Daniel finally looking at me. For a second, guilt flickered across his face. Just for a second. Then it disappeared again. I reached for my water glass and took a slow sip. I looked around the room. At the table Edward built. At the family photographs hanging on the walls. At the people sitting in front of me. Then I smiled softly. "You know," I said calmly, "I think you may be right." The room went completely still. Vanessa blinked once. Daniel looked confused. Even Emily looked up quickly. I smiled again and folded my hands together on the table. Maybe it is time for me to start thinking about smaller places and simpler things. And suddenly Vanessa looked happier than I had seen her in months. The energy inside the house changed after that dinner. It was subtle at first, but once I noticed it, I could not stop noticing it. Vanessa suddenly became kinder. Very kind. She started asking if I needed anything from the grocery store. She brought me tea one afternoon, while I was reading in the living room. She even offered to help organize my closet one morning. The same closet where my belongings had quietly started disappearing weeks earlier. Daniel seemed lighter too. He smiled more. He laughed at television shows again. Twice that week I caught him looking around the house with a thoughtful expression on his face. Measuring things with his eyes. Imagining things. I knew that look because Edward used to do the same thing whenever he planned home projects. The difference was Edward always built things for people. Daniel seemed to be building ideas for himself. I simply smiled and played my part. One evening Vanessa sat beside me on the couch while Emily worked on homework nearby. "Margaret," she said warmly, "I found a really beautiful community online today. They have gardens and walking trails and social events." I looked up from my book and smiled. "That sounds lovely." Vanessa's eyes lit up immediately. "Really?" I nodded slowly. "I think simple things sound nice these days." I could almost see excitement moving across her face. She quickly pulled out her phone and began showing me pictures. Bright buildings. Sunny rooms. Smiling older couples sitting near fountains and flower gardens. I looked carefully at every picture. I asked questions. I nodded at the right moments. Behind her smile I could almost hear her future unfolding in her mind. Upstairs bedroom changes. New furniture. Renovations. Space. Possibilities. 3 days later I invited everyone to dinner on Sunday night. I told them I wanted one nice family meal together before Christmas arrived. Vanessa looked delighted. Daniel agreed immediately. Emily smiled and hugged me. Sunday evening arrived with cold wind and soft snow falling outside. I cooked Edward's favorite meal. Pot roast with carrots and potatoes. Fresh rolls. Apple pie. The dining room looked warm beneath soft yellow light. Family photographs lined the walls around us. Memories watched from every direction. During dinner I laughed and listened and smiled. Vanessa talked excitedly about holiday decorations she wanted to buy after Christmas sales started. Daniel mentioned possible renovations around the house next year. I noticed the way he said around the house. Not my house. Not our house. Just the house. Halfway through dinner I placed my fork down beside my plate and looked around the table. Actually, I said softly, I have something for everyone tonight. Vanessa looked surprised. Daniel looked curious. Slowly I reached beside my chair and lifted a large manila envelope onto the table. Then I placed it gently in front of me and smiled. For a few seconds nobody spoke. The snow outside drifted slowly past the windows while warm light from the dining room chandelier fell across the table. I looked at Daniel. Then Vanessa. Then Emily sitting quietly beside me. I rested my hand on the envelope and smiled gently. I spent the last few weeks thinking about what everyone said, I began softly. And I realized something. Vanessa leaned forward slightly. Daniel looked confused. You were right. Life changes. I slid the envelope toward the center of the table. People get older. Circumstances change. Families make plans. Vanessa smiled immediately. She tried hiding it, but she smiled. Daniel looked uncertain. I opened the envelope and slowly removed several documents. Then I placed them carefully on the table. Daniel frowned as he looked down. Vanessa's smile faded little by little. Emily looked between all of us quietly. A few weeks ago I met with Martin Hayes, I said calmly. Daniel looked up suddenly. Martin? I nodded. Yes. Nobody moved. The room had become so quiet that I could hear the ticking clock hanging near the kitchen. Entrance. Edward planned very carefully before he passed away. I looked down at the papers and touched the top page lightly with my fingers. The house belongs entirely to me. Daniel blinked. Vanessa stared without speaking. The accounts remain protected exactly as Edward intended. I lifted my eyes toward them again. And before anyone asks, no arrangements can be made regarding property decisions, ownership transfers, or future plans without me. Vanessa's face had gone completely still now. Daniel looked down at the table. Mom! He started quietly. But I gently raised my hand. Not angrily. Just softly. Please let me finish. I looked around the room one last time. At the photographs on the walls. At the Christmas decorations near the fireplace. At the table Edward built all those years ago. You know what hurt me most? I asked quietly. It was never the house. Daniel slowly looked up at me. Vanessa sat frozen beside him. It was discovering that people I loved had already started making plans for my absence while I was still sitting here beside them. Nobody spoke. Emily looked down at her lap. Daniel's eyes filled with something I had not seen in months. Shame perhaps. Regret maybe. I folded the papers carefully and slipped them back into the envelope. Then I stood up slowly and looked toward Edward's empty chair near the family room doorway. I smiled softly. I used to think I lost my family after Edward passed away, I said quietly. But I did not lose them. I picked up the envelope and held it close against my chest. I simply started seeing them clearly. Then I turned and walked away while the snow continued falling outside our home.